and digital solutions on compliance. It's very current, so I'm going to start by talking about what does good look like? What are you expecting, or what are you aiming for? For some of you, you might be looking at this, well, this is obvious. You're aiming for 100% test pass rate. You're right. You're aiming for very, very small numbers of driver's hours infringements as a percentage of the number of days worked. 0.5% is not uncommon. I have clients who do that, but I wouldn't say it's the norm. The norm would be in the early single figures. If you're thinking, oh, ours is about 12%, you need help fast. And basically what you're looking at is the no major infringements. You're looking at where issues have arisen that you could demonstrate a documented investigatory process. And this is something that a lot of operators, even quite large operators, get wrong. They may follow up with drivers, they may follow up with managers and staff who are involved in managing drivers, because it's usually the whole tree you have to look at, but they don't actually address a record of that properly. And therefore, next time similar problems arise, they haven't got that history to draw upon to say, come on, we had this conversation a month ago or 2 months ago, we've got the same issues again, you're putting pressure on drivers or whatever. So the record is very important. Very important too are documents going to the statutory board of directors, if it's a limited company or the partners in the partnership, which summarise that. I'm not saying they want all the detail, they don't. They want exceptions, so they want to know when things are going wrong, and they want to be able to see from that what you've done about it, but they also want to see trends over time. So what is the compliance ratio in terms of tachograph infringements over time? Why am I running through this at the beginning? Because what I'm trying to do is set the benchmark for what you want out of your digital systems and how they can be so helpful compared with traditional paper systems in achieving this objective. Very important that anybody involved in driving or managing drivers or planning work, you can demonstrate their training is up to the mark, and that you can demonstrate that training is current and relevant to your operation. So generic CPC training won't work for many of you. You will need to top that up with training which you can demonstrate has been given and which deals with the work that you're dealing with. And then a process of assessing where you're at and where you want to be, because very few of you will be at 100% test pass rate or 0.5% infringements. That's your objective, that's what you're aiming for. And also, remember that drivers are your most valuable asset. They might also be the person that you curse the most often when you're managing an operation, but in the end, they are the things that make you the money. They make the business tick, and they're invaluable, in fact. Autonomous vehicles are a long way off in the real world, in my opinion, a long way off. You're going to need drivers for a long, long time yet. So it's very important that you're investing in their needs and their improvement. Otherwise, you'll lose them, because they're an increasingly scarce resource as a function of age, as well as a function of their desire to do the driving job. A lot of them are moving into other roles. In terms of defect reporting, you need clear, established processes for how the defects are identified by the drivers, are then reported in, and who makes the decision on whether it's safe or not. So a quick hands-up quiz for anybody who's listening. If a driver identifies a defect on a vehicle and he speaks to the fitter, about that defect, ultimately, hands up if you think that the fitter should decide whether the vehicle goes on the road or not. Hands up, none. Who thinks the driver should? Yeah, you're 100% right. If you drive a vehicle on the road, any vehicle, that's me, you, anybody, regardless of who's maintained it, you and you alone carry responsibility for that decision. And therefore, a driver must always be able to say, look, I'm not comfortable with this, I'm not taking that vehicle out. And you have to live with that as an operator. That is their obligation in law. Now, if they're being silly about it, fair enough. You're going to need to deal with that as a training or disciplinary issue. But most of them aren't. They just feel uncomfortable about it. They need to be empowered. A good example of this was a case I dealt with recently where a PSV vehicle had a defect on it in the form of an EBS light that come on, or an ABS light, I can't remember which now. And it put it into a mild limp mode. And he contacted the driver contacted the depot and said, this is what's happened. I'm in a mild limp mode. And the fitter said to him, well, do you feel comfortable bringing it back to the depot? Well, yeah, it's okay. It's in a mild limp mode, but I think I can get back fine. It was empty. So he starts driving it back. Anyway, on the motorway, this thing then went into a hard limp mode and down to a sub 10 miles an hour. I think it was even sub 5 miles an hour. And in that process, the driver realized obviously it was a big problem, puts his hazards on, starts moving over to the hard shoulder, but a vehicle behind, who hadn't appreciated the change, went crashing into the back of him and caused very serious injuries. And on the back of that, the question was asked, well, whose decision was it to take that vehicle on the road with that, in the original problem, and should it have been foreseeable that there might have been more issue? Now, it's a complicated case, and I'm not going to go into any more detail about it, but it is important that you think about that. Situations can change, and drivers need to understand that if a vehicle goes into limp mode, it might be a precursor to a much more severe problem with the vehicle. I've had that with my car, and I'm not going to talk about that now, but the reality is it can be a precursor to that. Suffice to say, in my car, the engine was kaput. You need to be looking in the modern world at drivers understanding not just the walk-round check that they carry out, but what the lights mean, the digital electronic management system within the vehicle. What do they mean, and what are sensible decisions? What do they look like based on those lights that are appearing? And you need to be able to demonstrate you've done that, because if somebody's dead or seriously injured, the driver will get prosecuted, but so can the managers and the senior managers within the business if you can't demonstrate that the driver had the right tools to make the right decisions. And there are plenty of examples of that. The worse the accident, the more likely that is to happen. So demonstrating the training is very important. On tachographs, similarly, the increasingly complex digital tachograph is leading to drivers who, let's face it, many of whom still grew up on the analog tachograph. We have a driver cohort that is predominantly within that age group in the PSV sector. They struggle as it is. The tachograph is mobile phone technology from the 1990s at the end of the day, with absolutely dreadful graphical user interface, or whatever they call it. You're pushing buttons to try and do manual entries, and drivers have to do this now for the last long period that 28 days, might be 56 days, watch this space, in a few months' time. So it's very important that you can demonstrate as an organisation that you've taught them how to do that properly, and what the alternatives are, the manual entry on the printout, the manual entry on an old analog card, and if you ever want to use it, an attestation letter. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's important. So with the increasing complexity of the equipment, so you have to address the knowledge base of the drivers that are using it. And these are drivers for whom tech is not usually their thing. Let's be fair, that's why they enjoy the job, a practical job rather than a tech job. But it's becoming a tech job. And ultimately, the culture within the business is obviously going to be increasingly focused on making sure that you can demonstrate that your systems and processes, your training, etc., produces this safety-first concept. And the drivers always have the power to say, stop, I'm not doing it, and that you'll deal with the consequence of that. If it means sending a second vehicle out, collecting passengers, whatever, you have that plan in place to be able to deal with that and manage that. This is the other side of the coin. These are the products and the tools which you might be using to actually manage the processes internally within your organisation. And there are major problems here. We are right at the beginning of the digital revolution in managing drivers and in managing vehicles and in managing journeys and planning journeys. There are multiple suppliers of digital products, many of which you will know, and many of which are very good. But often these products are very good at one or two areas and reasonable at other areas. And so you might, in a perfect world, for example, choose one product for your tachograph analysis because it's brilliant at that, especially if you do mixed work. You need a product that does domestic analysis, EU analysis, and will do both sets of working time regulations on the one hand, but another product entirely to look after the vehicle maintenance records, the vehicle maintenance planning, the driver defect reporting, by using an app on the phone. Now that immediately presents a problem because they're not necessarily communicating with each other. So you've got 2 or even 3 sets of different digital processes there. And that is basically a poor solution for many businesses because you need 3 sets of knowledge, 3 sets of software to learn. One of the biggest issues is that a lot of businesses who are having to embrace this software and earned recognition, DVSA, we're here earlier, is part of that process. They're having to embrace this software, and they are really using about 5 to 10% of the functionality. And they're often blending it with other systems which they've historically had. So you'll have, for example, a digital PMI or digital maintenance record system, digital planning, but you'll still be using a paper-based driver defect reporting system. Well, that's actually quite difficult because you need both to talk to each other in a perfect world so that you get repeat defects, inadequate repairs identified automatically, systematically by the software, reducing the burden. Whereas in the way that I've just described, where you've got a paper system for part, a digital system for part, you're not going to get that. You're going to have to do the exercise traditionally. And actually, it's more difficult to look through a lot of digital PMI records than it is a lot of paper ones. It takes about 10 seconds to review a paper PMI record. On a digital record, you've got to find it, open the folder, open the file, find the relevant one, hunt down, compare it with the driver sheet to see if there's been a defect reported and repaired. If there hasn't, you've then got to follow it up with the driver. It becomes more onerous, not less onerous. And that's a big issue. So when you're thinking of implementing these systems, it's really important to be thinking about your operation and each of the segments of it, particularly defect reporting and PMI records. Does the system provide what you need, and does it all provide it under one house? Or if not, do they talk to each other? Now, over time, increasingly they will, but initially, as with all software, they often won't. They won't talk to each other. Another problem with small medium operators particularly is you might have several suppliers. So one's using R2C, one's using Distinctive Systems, one's using some other system, and one's on paper. I had a client with just that the other day. Depending on the age of the vehicle, depending on the type of vehicle, bus, whether a coach, whatever. Some are doing it in-house, some are doing outsourced. Electrification is going to involve increasing outsourcing. So you've got these multiple different sources of digital data. And often as a smaller business, it's outside your control as to whether or not those 3 or 4 different systems will actually communicate with each other. And that's a big problem because you'll then have somebody, the transport manager. Hands up if you're a transport manager. Anybody here? There's a few, about a third of you. Fair enough. Good on you. But that system means that you have 3 different types of records to examine in that scenario. You're comparing driver defect forms, which usually will be common across all vehicles, with those systems, which is challenging for the reasons I've just said. So the training and the fluency of the system in terms of the way you operate it, the way you use it, is unbelievably important. And as IT systems develop over time, it's going to become absolutely critical and central that you can demonstrate that your team know how to work it properly. If the DVSA come in and if they find the records are incomplete or services are late or driver defect isn't working, you need to be able to demonstrate, well, if you're the owner of a business, for example, that the transport manager has been given the training and resource to do that. But on the other hand, the benefit is you get that right, a lot of the processes which currently are done manually and are quite time-consuming will be done automatically. They'll produce the digital record and the digital report for the benefit of the board, for example, by themselves. And you'll be able to tweak that and develop it, as you can with all software, to produce something that's more relevant to your operation. So this is the sort of direction of travel. But we're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination. In the simplest implementations, we're much further down the road, but in complex scenarios that I've described, we're not there. And what happens, unfortunately, when we get hearings involving these systems, is public inquiries, is that invariably the issue falls between the stools of the different systems. And there's an inability to get the data out that the Traffic Commissioner expects the operator to be looking at, simply because of a lack of sophistication with the software, which, let's face it, I think we can all relate to, those of us who've been around the block a bit. What are you aiming for? Well, you're aiming to have a system that in the end, digitally, because in the end, in 10 years, it'll be pretty much all digital, and between now and then, we'll all be on this journey. You're aiming so that when you want data on a particular aspect, so I don't know, tyres, tyre age, or tyre replacement, or brakes replacement, or other essential parts which could render the vehicle unroadworthy, you'll be able to produce that at the touch of a couple of keys. You know, I want to know what the average life of our tyres are, what the average life, or mileage, what the average mileage of our brakes are, what the average mileage of our brake actuators are, for example, because that's a part that often seems to fail on test, and you don't want that. So the win is massive, because you'll be able to see how long things are lasting on average. You'll be able to do that by part manufacturer, for example, and then you'll be able to form your own view as to what you want within your business and what works within your business. And that information, which is currently available and used within very large operations already, will be available to all operations. And indeed, I can see down the line a market developing where people are actually marketing their parts on the basis of longevity and resilience to wear, on the basis of this data, because it'll be available to them if it isn't already. So you'll run the digital system as a genuine other person within the business to provide a role that was previously done not as well by a lot of humans having to consistently do analysis of documents. But we are a long way off this. And let's go back to the tachograph side of things for a second. The current tachograph analysis software, let's say there's Optac 3, which is an excellent piece of software if you're doing certain types of analysis. TrueTach, another excellent piece of software, particularly mixing domestic and GB rules, and TACO rules. Those pieces of software, and there are others as well, and they're all good. The issue with those software is, though, they don't actually know what the driver was doing. So it doesn't know if the driver was actually having a break, was waiting to be allowed to go, so it's a period of availability, or was actually assisting passengers with loading luggage onto a coach. You know, it still requires human input. But it won't be long at all before the distinctive systems in a coach operation plan will be using artificial intelligence. I don't like that phrase, it's somewhat meaningless, but using algorithms which are designed to analyze the data. It'll be able to show that record of break coincides with the time when the driver must have been loading or unloading passengers, yeah? Because they were at a school and they were going on a foreign trip, so it can't be a break. And the software will be able to do this. The enforcement authority software will, but so will yours. But at the moment it can't, so you have to do it. So there's still significant human input required in tachograph analysis. But over time it will improve, and if you use the tools correctly, it'll make it much quicker and much easier to be on top of driver attitude. If operatives are using apps on their personal devices, which is very common, a mobile phone with a defect reporting app or a work planning app, or often both combined into one, obviously it's important that you know what's happening there. You know, from a data point of view, you might have client or customer data on there. You've got to be on top of that. The GDPR implications of this are massive, where you've got client booking and personal home domestic data. Think about it. You've booked a coach holiday with said company. They've got it all on the driver's phone. The driver's phone gets nicked, and they've got a list of people who aren't at home for a fortnight. You know, so, and the GDPR risk of that will come back to you. You might want to look at cybersecurity in that context of something of that type. So it's very important that you might want even insurance for that, and that is increasingly available. So it's very important to make sure that those devices are properly sandboxed, that you can switch off accessibility to that data, that it might be hidden behind a two-factor authentication or some sort of biometric fingerprint or face recognition technology, so that if the phone is nicked, the data is not available, and you can switch it off. If there is anti-malware software, I should say, having malware software up to date is not necessarily a good idea. Anti-malware software up to date is going to be important, and you'll have to demonstrate that. And as a law firm, we obviously have a very heightened level of data security requirement on us. So we're probably, compared with many ordinary businesses, many other businesses at least, somewhat above the curve here, and it's very complex. It's very complex, to get this right. It's not a small issue, but digitization is going to mean it's an issue every business has to embrace. Things like bus open data. There are advantages to the bus open data system. The whole idea of the thing is more people use the bus because they know where it's going, because they can find it on their phone. But the other side of it is that it provides data which the DVSA can use using the analysis bus open data tool to assess your punctuality performance and your reliability performance of your bus services. So what does that mean? Well, you'll be doing that anyway if you operate bus services. You'll be doing it using your own software. And it might produce a different result to the bus open data software because of the way it approaches the subject. Like all computer systems, they analyze things slightly differently. It's important you know what both are doing. So where you have available to you, and it is available to you, the ABOD system, where you have it available to you to analyze your performance as seen by the enforcement agencies, you've got to be looking at it. You've got to be looking at what they're seeing about you. And it's because you've got to understand that if it's different from what you're seeing, you might have to explain that down the line. And indeed, you might want to liaise with the DFT, because these are effectively beta products. In other words, they're not in their final iteration. You want to liaise with them and say, look, this isn't accurate, and they can work out why it's not accurate, because they will presume that their data, their analysis is accurate. They will assume their analysis is accurate, and yours isn't, because that's just the way of government, because they haven't got skin in the game and you have, if you know what I mean. So it's important that you're able to keep on top of that. And there are things like the footprints arriving early at terminus, etc. And rather jokingly at the bottom, you might end up employing a PhD student from Oxford University in order to analyse this stuff. But in reality, we are all going to have to get more slick looking at this data and using it as the enforcement agencies will use it in order to understand what they're seeing and get the most out of it. Ultimately, still good management is the same as it's always been. Short management trees, good decision making between the transport manager and the directors, high level of communication between those two. The passenger sector has nearly always got this right. You're a lot ahead of the large goods vehicle sector on this stuff. So generally speaking, you're good. Somebody's obviously trying to nick a vehicle from here, which is a bit game, isn't it? But anyway. Clear communication channels between the manager and the operation machine. So it's important that the communication is the other way, that the transport manager's role and decision making is demonstrably affected, and don't allow the digital implementation of route planning or driver recording to get in the way of that communication. In the end, the human is still the person responsible, and if there's a bad accident, the person who's going to have the noose around their neck. So it's important that these tools are used to complement the role, but not supplant it until such time as you're allowed to appoint a computer as your transport manager. Hands up for that option, but we're not there yet. So in the end, as we move into an increasingly complex digital world, problems are inevitably going to arise. The ones I've described, the different software systems, the different maintenance suppliers, the integration of paper, the driver who just can't work the device correctly, and so on. It's how you're addressing those, how you're documenting your process to do so. And sometimes, with some members of staff, it might be they can't work in your organisation if they just are never going to get there. And I've had that scenario with a driver who couldn't operate the digital tachograph and was committing legion record-keeping offences over 2 years before the operator finally said to him, look, you're never going to get this. You need to be doing shunting or something else that doesn't involve tachographs. He just couldn't get there. And some people will be in that camp. But the vast majority, if they get it right, will find their job is easier. And certainly from a management point of view, a lot of the process will be automated. But I think we're a long way from artificial intelligence being human intelligence. I don't think we're out of the loop just yet. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. Just a very quick one from me. Obviously, from what you're saying, the digital tide will never be turned, but it's quite a frightening prospect with all these different systems all offering you different things, and some can do this, some can do that. And obviously, if you go into a supplier, they're going to tell you theirs is the best.
Yeah.
Is there any independent source of advice that people can go to and say, this is what I need to cover?
Yeah,
is there somewhere they can go to try and get somebody who's not selling, but just advising?
Now, there's a fantastic opportunity here. What tachograph? You know, what hi-fi, what car, what tachograph. I don't think it's a seller.
Yeah.
But there should be, and there probably will be. There are consultants who can assist you with implementing. So, for example, on the tachograph side of things, I know of consultants who will assist with making those choices. Similarly, on the maintenance side, so you can get guidance. You've got to be careful that they're neutral. In other words, they're not just trying to peddle the software that they like. Because it's convenient to them. You need somebody to peddle the software that's suitable for you. But it's novel, it's new, you know, and to my knowledge, there isn't any sort of general objective supplier of advice. It's about doing your own research.
Maybe there's an opening there. Anybody got any questions for James before we wrap this up? Anybody got anything burning?
Everybody's just ready for
everybody's
dinner,
ready for that. Oh, sorry, we got one. Oh, hang on, let me get to you, or we'll never hear you.
I didn't have a question as such as an invite to the CPT stand for our drinks in a little bit.
All right, I'll come over. That's good. You see an invite. Anybody else got any invites?
Right. I wish all the questions were like that, actually.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, I'm not interested in what you've been talking about, but come for a booze up. Perfect. All right. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, James, for giving us all that information, even though some of it was rather scary. Thank you.
Thank you.